This now, more and more businesses are considering vaccine mandates for the workplace. This after the president said government will form a task team to look into making vaccines compulsory for people to access some areas and engage in certain activities. The Forum for Business, Government and Labour is holding its 26th annual summit today with a focus to reach an agreement on mandatory vaccinations. eNCA's Heidi Giokos is following that story and joins us now for an update. And Heidi, we know that top of the agenda of the NEDLAC summit is this whole debate about whether or not to make vaccines mandatory for certain sectors and for certain activities, particularly in the economy. How has the conversation been going there at NEDLAC?
Yes, certainly. I must say that many were waiting to hear what the discussion would be like when it comes to mandatory vaccines. We are seeing the fact that the president came out about a week ago to say that a task team has been established to discuss mandatory vaccines. The latest company, MTN, Standard Bank, Discovery, coming out and saying that vaccines will become mandatory in the workplace. But we are joined by Employment and Labour Minister THULAS. Thank you so much for your time, Minister. We appreciate it. I think many people want to know what the decision is regarding mandatory vaccines from NEDLAC. What is the decision regarding this?
There's no firm decision yet. There are processes which have been recommended, like NEDLAC has indicated. They've made recommendations that we need to strengthen our direction in terms of health and safety to ensure that we are able to look at the sectors where you can make it mandatory, sectors like tourism and so on. And that's a process recommendation because the issue is a constitutional, legal and a rights issue. Nobody can just simply prescribe on this particular matter. Therefore, whatever we have to do, you have heard even today, on behalf of Labour, the Labour representatives, Mr. Peginchalinchali said they are opposed to a mandatory vaccine. So we have to tread carefully in terms of this. And as government, we have also said, and we have not directed business or PUSA to go into the Constitutional Court. They themselves independently have decided on. But we said we support that because that declaration is going to give us an assurance, is going to give us the issue of the constitutionality of mandatory vaccines if they have to be done. And it's going to come to the issue of individual versus the collective rights, the issue of public health or public interest. So what we are saying is that it's the court which can be able to rule on such issues, not us. So as a government which is working within the prescripts of the Constitution, we have to respect the rights of everybody.
Sure, we have to respect the rights of everybody, but you are finding workplaces that are now implementing these policies that are making vaccines mandatory. As the Employment and Labour Minister and here today representing NEDLAC, what is the stance of mandatory vaccines? You mentioned in your speech earlier that when there's a risk assessment, mandatory vaccines should be considered and vaccinated people should be possibly allowed into spaces and events. And that speaks to the fact that unvaccinated people will possibly not be allowed. So I just want to get more, if I can push you a little more on the mandatory vaccines.
You can't get more, except that I can tell you, we are saying it must be considered. And what is important to us, it's not just an imposition. What is important to us is to be able to engage those workers. There are a number of areas where workers were not engaged. We must engage those workers and we must try and persuade them with powerful reasoning why this has to be done. And what we are saying is also we need to deal with misinformation and misconceptions because the problem of the anti-vaxxers have been able to influence the people without any scientific knowledge. So that's very, very important. So at the end of the day, we are saying persuasion is better than imposition because you might find that resistance. But I'm saying consider on those particular areas where there's threat of life, and that can be considered. And that's why as we are drafting those directions, we have to be carefully delineate those particular areas.
Just lastly, Minister, we've run out of time, but I have to ask you this. The National Union of Mine Workers has just released its statement regarding mandatory vaccines. They are completely opposed to this, and they are rejecting with contempt the fact that certain mines are forcing people to be vaccinated, and if they're not vaccinated, they need to provide PCR negative tests at their own cost. What is your response to this?
That's why my argument is that persuasion is better than forcing people. So if there's persuasion, and reasoning, we would be able to convince a number of people. And let's allow for that to take place. But it's urgent, unfortunately, because the variant is spreading. So we still believe that persuasion is very, very important. But it might be unavoidable that in some of the sectors we might have to come with the mandatory, but we have to thread carefully when we deal with that particular issue.
Great. Thank you so much for your insights. We do appreciate it. That's Employment and Labour Minister THULAS NXESI. And I think it's important to highlight, THULAS, the fact that there probably is going to be a lot of court action with regards to the possibility of mandatory vaccines. And we do know that it's going to be a question about whether it's one's constitutional right to be unvaccinated. And this is the point that the Minister has been making, to say that perhaps we should persuade before we force people to get the vaccine. Of course, this lies with the President. Task team has been established.
Yeah, Heidi, and it does appear that in true and typical South African fashion, the debate will be lively, robust, to say the least. Because, for instance, I hear there that the Minister mentions that the COSATU representative, Begintshalintshalli, says they are opposed to mandatory vaccines. But actually, in the last few days and weeks, we've been reporting that the official position of COSATU is that they would support mandatory vaccinations. So